Around 2150 before Common Era, in the windswept ruins of what had been the mightiest city in Mesopotamia, Sumerian scribes gathered to record one of the most extraordinary documents in ancient history. The Curse of Agade, inscribed on clay tablets that would survive nearly 4 millennia, describes in precise detail the catastrophic destruction of Akkad, a city so thoroughly annihilated that archaeologists have never definitively located its remains, despite over a century of intensive searching. What makes this text particularly remarkable is not merely its literary power, but the archaeological evidence that confirms its account of a civilization-ending catastrophe that occurred within a single generation. The tablets describe how Naram-Sin, grandson of the legendary Sargon, committed an unforgivable sacrilege against the temple of Enlil at Nippur, triggering divine retribution that manifested as environmental collapse, economic devastation, and invasion by foreign peoples who swept down from the mountains to obliterate Akkadian civilization. Modern excavations have revealed evidence of rapid abandonment, environmental stress, and violent destruction at sites throughout the Akkadian Empire precisely corresponding to the timeline described in these ancient texts. The precision with which the curse describes specific phases of collapse, the technical details about agricultural failure and infrastructure breakdown, and the archaeological correlation with actual historical events suggest this document preserves genuine historical memory rather than mythological invention. The implications challenge conventional understanding of ancient texts as purely religious literature, revealing instead sophisticated historical recording that encoded actual events within religious frameworks to ensure their preservation across millennia. The archaeological record from the 23rd century before Common Era reveals an empire of extraordinary scope and sophistication centered on the still undiscovered capital of Akkad. Cuneiform administrative tablets from sites including Girsu, Umma, and Adab document a bureaucratic system that controlled territories extending from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast, managing resources, labor, and military forces through standardized protocols that demonstrated unprecedented organizational capability. Excavations at Tell Leilan in northeastern Syria, conducted by the British School of Archaeology between 2006 and 2010, uncovered evidence of Akkadian imperial administration, including a massive building complex that served as a regional governmental center, containing thousands of tablets that document grain shipments, troop movements, and tribute payments from conquered territories. The scale of Akkadian administrative operations becomes evident through analysis of tablet archives discovered at multiple sites across the empire. The Girsu archive, excavated by French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzec beginning in 1877, contained over 30,000 cuneiform tablets documenting every aspect of provincial governance, including agricultural production, craft manufacturing, trade operations, and military logistics. These tablets reveal a sophisticated bureaucratic hierarchy, with specialized departments managing different aspects of imperial administration, all reporting ultimately to the royal palace at Akkad through a network of regional governors and local officials. The standardization of tablet formats, accounting procedures, and administrative terminology across territories separated by hundreds of kilometers demonstrates centralized control and systematic training of scribal personnel who maintained consistent record-keeping practices throughout the empire. The physical infrastructure supporting Akkadian imperial power appears in archaeological contexts across Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. Excavations at Tell Leilan in northeastern Syria, identified as ancient Urkesh, revealed massive fortification walls and a monumental palace complex constructed during the Akkadian period, demonstrating how the empire projected military power through strategic strongholds that controlled key trade routes and communication corridors. The fortifications at Urkesh incorporated advanced defensive features, including multiple concentric walls, towers positioned at regular intervals for overlapping fields of fire, and sophisticated gate systems that channeled approaching forces into killing zones, where defenders could concentrate their attacks. The engineering knowledge required for these defensive systems and the labor mobilization necessary for their construction indicate organizational capabilities that exceeded anything previously documented in Mesopotamian contexts. Trade networks documented in Akkadian administrative archives extended across known world regions, connecting Mesopotamia with distant territories through systematic exchange relationships that brought raw materials and luxury goods to imperial centers. Tablets from the Umma archive describe shipments of copper from Oman, tin from sources in Iran or Central Asia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedarwood from Lebanon, and carnelian from the Indus Valley, demonstrating commercial connections spanning thousands of kilometres. The volume of trade documented in these archives suggests that Akkadian merchants operated according to standardised contracts and enjoyed imperial protection that enabled safe passage through potentially hostile territories. Archaeological evidence of Akkadian trade goods appears at sites throughout the ancient Near East and beyond, including distinctive cylinder seals found in contexts from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf that mark the presence of Akkadian merchants and administrators in distant regions. The military power supporting Akkadian imperial expansion appears both in textual accounts and archaeological evidence of conquest and occupation. Royal inscriptions describe campaigns against the mountain peoples of the Zagros, expeditions to the cedar forests of Lebanon, and naval operations in the Persian Gulf that extended Akkadian influence to regions never before controlled by Mesopotamian powers. The archaeological signature of Akkadian military conquest appears in destruction levels at formerly independent cities, followed by rebuilding phases that incorporate Akkadian architectural styles and administrative systems. At Tell Leilan, excavations revealed evidence of violent destruction in the late early dynastic period, followed immediately by construction of the massive Akkadian administrative complex, suggesting military conquest followed by rapid integration into the imperial system. The Sumerian king list and numerous royal inscriptions preserved at Nippur describe Sargon of Akkad as a revolutionary figure who transformed Mesopotamian political organization through military conquest and administrative innovation that created the world's first true empire. Tablet CBS 1989 from the University of Pennsylvania collection contains a biographical account describing Sargon's rise from humble origins as cupbearer to the king of Kish, his establishment of Akkad as his capital, and his 54-year reign during which he conquered Sumerian city-states and extended Akkadian control across the entire Mesopotamian plain. The text provides specific details about military campaigns, including the conquest of Uruk, where he defeated Lugal-Zaghazi, the transportation of soil from Babylon to create the foundation of Akkad, and the establishment of trade routes extending to Anatolia and the Indus Valley that brought unprecedented wealth to his empire. The narrative of Sargon's rise, preserved in multiple textual sources, demonstrates remarkable consistency across documents separated by centuries, suggesting the account preserves genuine historical memory rather than later legendary invention. The text describes how Sargon, serving as cupbearer to Ur-Nammu, king of Kish, gained the trust and confidence of his master through loyal service and administrative competence. According to the account, Sargon then rebelled against Ur-Nammu, seized control of Kish, and used this base to launch campaigns against the Sumerian city-states that had previously dominated southern Mesopotamia. The conquest of Uruk, the largest and most powerful Sumerian city, marked the decisive moment in Sargon's rise to supremacy, as he defeated and captured Lugal-Zaghazi, the king who had himself recently unified much of Sumer through military conquest. The founding of Akkad as a new capital represented a deliberate break with Sumerian political traditions and established a power centre independent of the old city-states, with their established priesthoods and entrenched aristocracies. The location of Akkad remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries, but textual evidence indicates it was positioned strategically in northern Babylonia, where it could control both the agricultural resources of southern Mesopotamia and the trade routes connecting the region to northern territories. The text's reference to Sargon bringing soil from Babylon to create Akkad's foundation may indicate the city was built on previously unoccupied ground, a virgin site without existing political or religious institutions that might constrain royal power. Sargon's military campaigns extended Akkadian control far beyond traditional Mesopotamian boundaries, reaching territories that had never been incorporated into earlier Sumerian polities. Royal inscriptions describe campaigns to the Upper Sea, generally identified as the Mediterranean, and to the Lower Sea, the Persian Gulf, claiming that Sargon made ships from Meluhha, Magan, and Dilmun dock at the Quay of Akkad. These references to Meluhha, usually identified with the Indus Valley, Magan, associated with Oman, and Dilmun, linked to Bahrain, indicate that Akkadian trade networks reached across the entire breadth of the ancient Near Eastern world and beyond into South Asia. The administrative innovations introduced during Sargon's reign transformed Mesopotamian governance and established patterns that would influence Near Eastern political organization for millennia. The standardization of weights and measures across the empire facilitated trade and tax collection, while making economic activities more transparent to central authorities. The development of a professional bureaucracy staffed by trained scribes who owed their positions to royal appointment rather than hereditary privilege created an administrative class loyal to the crown rather than to local interests. The use of Akkadian as an administrative language throughout the empire, regardless of local linguistic preferences, established linguistic standardization that enhanced communication and control across diverse territories. Administrative records from Girsu and Nippur document a dramatic shift in Akkadian royal ideology during the reign of Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, who ruled from approximately 2190 to 2154 before Common Era. Unlike previous Mesopotamian rulers who claimed divine sanction for their authority, Naram-Sin took the unprecedented step of declaring himself an actual god, adding the divine determinative sign to his name in official inscriptions and demanding worship at temples throughout his empire. The victory stele of Naram-Sin, discovered at Susa in 1901 by French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan and now housed in the Louvre Museum, depicts the king wearing the horned crown traditionally reserved for deities, standing above his enemies in a composition that visually proclaims his divine status through artistic conventions normally applied only to gods. The assertion of divine kingship represented a radical departure from traditional Mesopotamian political theology, which maintained clear distinctions between human rulers who governed by divine mandate and the gods themselves who dwelt in celestial realms and manifested in temple sanctuaries. Previous Mesopotamian kings, including Sargon himself, presented themselves as servants chosen by the gods to maintain order and ensure prosperity, acknowledging their subordinate status within a cosmic hierarchy that placed divine beings above human authorities. Naram-Sin's claim to actual divinity challenged this fundamental ordering of cosmic authority and positioned the king as an object of worship rather than merely an intermediary between gods and humans. The visual representation of Naram-Sin's divine status on the victory stele employs artistic conventions that leave no ambiguity about his claimed godhood. The stele, carved from pink limestone and standing 3.3 meters tall, depicts Naram-Sin climbing a mountain toward the sun god, wearing the distinctive horned crown that Mesopotamian artistic tradition reserved exclusively for divine beings. The composition places Naram-Sin at a scale significantly larger than the soldiers who accompany him and the enemies who fall beneath his feet, using size differentiation to indicate divine superiority in the same manner used in depictions of gods overwhelming human opponents. The artistic program of the stele thus translates Naram-Sin's ideological claims into visual form that would be immediately comprehensible to ancient viewers familiar with Mesopotamian iconographic conventions. The administrative implementation of divine kingship appears in cuneiform tablets from across the empire that document establishment of cults dedicated to Naram-Sin's worship. Texts from Girsu describe the allocation of agricultural land to support temples where Naram-Sin received offerings and where priests conducted rituals honoring the divine king. Administrative records document the appointment of priesthoods dedicated to the king's cult, the construction of shrines and altars for his worship, and the integration of royal cult celebrations into the official religious calendar alongside festivals honoring traditional deities. The systematic nature of these arrangements indicates that Naram-Sin's deification was not merely rhetorical or symbolic, but involved concrete institutional changes that required subjects to worship their king as they worshipped the gods. The theological implications of Naram-Sin's self-deification extended beyond mere political propaganda to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of divinity and the relationship between cosmic order and earthly power. If the king was truly divine, then his commands carried absolute authority that could not be questioned or resisted without committing sacrilege. This theological position enhanced royal power by removing any grounds for legitimate opposition based on appeals to divine law or traditional customs, as the divine king himself became the ultimate source of law and the arbiter of what constituted proper religious observance. The consolidation of religious and political authority in the person of the divine king represented the logical culmination of the centralization process that had characterized Akkadian imperial development. Archaeological excavations at Nippur, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900, uncovered the remains of the Akkad temple complex, the most sacred religious site in ancient Mesopotamia, and the earthly dwelling of Enlil, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon who controlled atmospheric forces and held authority over human civilization. The temple precinct covered approximately 45,000 square meters and included multiple structures built and rebuilt over millennia, with the earliest levels dating to the Ubaid period around 5000 before Common Era. Cuneiform texts from the site describe the Eka as the cosmic axis connecting heaven and earth, where divine decrees were issued that determined the fates of cities and kings throughout Mesopotamia, making it the ultimate source of political legitimacy for any ruler who sought to govern the region. The physical remains of the Eka complex reveal the extraordinary resources devoted to Enlil's worship and the central importance of this sanctuary in Mesopotamian religious and political life. Excavations uncovered massive foundation platforms constructed from mud brick, temple buildings with walls several meters thick, storage facilities for offerings and tribute, residential quarters for priestly personnel, and workshop areas where craftsmen produced ritual objects and maintained temple equipment. The stratigraphic sequence revealed continuous occupation and rebuilding across more than 3 millennia, with each successive generation investing enormous labour in maintaining and enhancing the temple facilities. The scale of construction and the wealth evident in recovered artefacts including gold and silver ritual vessels, precious stone inlays, and elaborate bronze fittings demonstrate that the Akkad received tributes from across Mesopotamia and served as a repository of regional wealth. The theological significance of the Akkad extended far beyond its function as Enlil's earthly residence to encompass its role as the cosmic centre, where heaven and earth intersected, and where divine authority over human civilization was exercised. Cuneiform texts describe the Akkad as the mountain house, using architectural metaphor to express theological concepts about the temple's role as the axis mundi connecting terrestrial and celestial realms. Within the Ekkad's inner sanctum, Enlil issued the Tablets of Destiny, divine decrees that determine the fates of cities, the success or failure of harvests, the outcomes of military campaigns, and the legitimacy of royal authority throughout Mesopotamia. Kings who wished to establish their right to rule sought endorsement from Enlil through elaborate ceremonies conducted at the Akkad, where favourable omens and successful ritual performances demonstrated divine approval. The priesthood serving the Akkad constituted a powerful institution that maintained extensive archives, controlled significant economic resources, and wielded enormous political influence throughout Mesopotamian history. The priests preserved ancient traditions, maintained genealogical records of divine and human rulers, conducted astronomical observations that regulated the ritual calendar, and controlled access to the inner sanctum where communication with Enlil occurred. Their specialized knowledge and their role as intermediaries between the supreme god and human civilization gave them authority that even the most powerful kings had to respect and accommodate. The Eka priesthood's independence from direct royal control and their claim to represent cosmic authority that transcended earthly political arrangements meant they could serve as a check on royal power and a source of legitimacy independent of military might or administrative efficiency. The architectural program of the Eka incorporated design elements that reinforced its theological significance and created spaces appropriate for divine presence and ritual performance. The temple's orientation aligned with astronomical phenomena significant in Mesopotamian cosmology. Its internal organization reflected symbolic patterns that mapped cosmic order onto terrestrial space, and its decoration employed iconography that communicated theological concepts about Enlil's nature and functions. The ziggurat associated with the temple complex, rising in stepped levels toward the sky, provided a visual representation of the connection between earth and heaven while creating an elevated platform where divine and human realms could intersect. The physical experience of approaching the temple, ascending through its various courts and chambers toward the inner sanctum, created a ritual journey that separated sacred space from the profane world and prepared participants for encounter with divine presence. The Curse of Agade, preserved on multiple tablets from the Old Babylonian period, describes in devastating detail how Naram-Sin violated the sanctity of Enlil's temple at Nippur, an act of sacrilege so profound that it triggered divine retribution against his entire civilization. The text states that Naram-Sin, frustrated by unfavourable omens that prevented him from renovating the Ekkor according to his plans, assembled his troops and violently attacked the temple complex, tearing down its gates, destroying its sacred groves, and plundering its treasury of precious metals and ritual objects. Tablet CBS 14221 from the University of Pennsylvania collection provides additional details, describing how Naram-Sin soldiers defiled the inner sanctum, smashed cult statues, and murdered priests who attempted to prevent the desecration, actions that violated every principle of sacred law that governed Mesopotamian civilization. The circumstances leading to Naram-Sin's attack on the Ekkor reveal tensions between royal ambition and religious authority that had been building throughout the Akkadian period. According to the text, Naram-Sin planned extensive renovations to the Ekkor temple, either to demonstrate his piety through lavish building projects or to assert control over the institution by reshaping its physical structures according to his own designs. The king consulted omens to determine whether the gods approved his renovation plans, but repeatedly received unfavourable signs that indicated divine opposition to his proposals. Rather than accepting these negative omens as binding divine communications that constrained his actions, Naram-Sin chose to proceed with his plans despite clear religious prohibition, demonstrating a hubris that placed his own will above cosmic order as communicated through traditional divinatory practices. The violent assault on the Ekkor complex represented an unprecedented attack on the most fundamental institutions of Mesopotamian civilization and a direct challenge to the cosmic order those institutions maintained. The text describes how Naram-Sin's soldiers broke down the temple's gates, sacred barriers that separated divine space from the profane world, and that no unauthorized person would normally dare to breach. They cut down the sacred groves, trees planted as offerings to Enlil and maintained as part of the temple's ritual landscape, destroying vegetation that had grown for generations as living symbols of divine-human relationship. They plundered the treasury, seizing precious metals and ritual objects that had accumulated over centuries as offerings from kings and cities seeking Enlil's favour, treating sacred property as ordinary spoils of war to be distributed among troops or redirected to royal purposes. The desecration of the inner sanctum constituted the ultimate sacrilege, as Naram-Sin's soldiers penetrated the most sacred space, where only properly purified priests could enter, and where Enlil's presence dwelt in concentrated intensity. The smashing of cult statues, physical representations of divine presence that served as focal points for ritual communication with the gods, represented direct assault on divinity itself, rather than merely destruction of religious property. The murder of priests who attempted to defend the temple violated not only human life, but also the sanctity of religious office, as these individuals held positions that connected them directly to divine authority and made them representatives of cosmic order. Each of these violations compounded the offence, creating a cascade of sacrilege that the text presents as justifying the catastrophic punishment that would follow. The theological implications of Naram-Sin's attack extended beyond the immediate physical damage to challenge the fundamental principles governing Mesopotamian cosmology. By violating the Akkad despite clear divine prohibition communicated through omens, Naram-Sin demonstrated contempt for the traditional mechanisms through which gods communicated their will to humans. By attacking the temple with military force, he treated sacred space as subject to royal power, rather than as autonomous divine territory that constrained even the mightiest kings. By plundering the temple treasury and murdering its priests, he rejected the principle that religious institutions possessed rights and immunities that secular authority was bound to respect. The attack thus represented not merely a crime against one temple, but a revolutionary assertion that royal power recognized no limits imposed by religious authority or cosmic law. The immediate consequence of Naram-Sin's sacrilege, according to the cuneiform texts, was Enlil's withdrawal from Nippur and his departure to the mountains beyond human civilization, taking with him the divine protection that had sustained Mesopotamian prosperity for millennia. The Curse of Agade describes this abandonment in terms that modern readers might interpret as the collapse of institutional structures and administrative systems, as Enlil's absence meant the cessation of the divine decrees that regulated seasonal cycles, agricultural productivity and social order. Tablet Veit 9123 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin contains parallel passages describing how other gods followed Enlil's example, abandoning their own temple cities throughout the empire, creating a cascade of institutional failure that left human civilization without the divine guidance that had structured every aspect of Mesopotamian life. The theological language describing Enlil's departure employs metaphors of physical withdrawal that expressed the god's abandonment of his earthly dwelling and his removal from active engagement with human affairs. The text describes Enlil ascending to the mountains, returning to the primordial wilderness beyond civilization's boundaries where divine beings dwelt before establishing ordered society in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. This imagery of divine withdrawal to mountain refuges appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian religious literature as a metaphor for the severing of relationships between gods and humans, the cessation of divine blessings that sustained agricultural productivity and social harmony, and the removal of cosmic order that protected civilization from the chaos constantly threatening to overwhelm human achievements. The practical consequences of divine abandonment manifested in the collapse of institutional systems that had regulated Mesopotamian society for centuries. Temple complexes throughout the empire, which had served not only as religious centers, but also as administrative hubs, managing agricultural production, craft manufacturing and trade operations, ceased to function effectively as their divine patrons withdrew protection and guidance. The regular cycle of religious festivals that had structured the agricultural year and coordinated economic activities across the empire fell into disarray as priests lost confidence in their ability to communicate with absent deities. The oracular systems through which rulers had sought divine guidance for political and military decisions produced only negative omens or remained silent, leaving leaders without the supernatural counsel that had legitimized their authority and guided their decision-making. Administrative tablets from Girsu and other major centers document the cascading institutional failures that followed divine abandonment. Records show dramatic declines in temple revenues as agricultural lands dedicated to divine estates produced diminished harvests, and as tributary cities reduced or ceased their traditional offerings to sanctuaries whose gods had departed. Personnel rosters reveal the dissolution of temple workshop staffs as craftsmen abandoned their positions when regular wages and rations could no longer be distributed reliably. Construction projects documented in earlier administrative records abruptly ceased, with building materials left unused and work crews disbanded as the coordinated planning and resource allocation necessary for major public works collapsed, along with the institutional frameworks that had supported them. The withdrawal of secondary deities from their own temple cities throughout the empire compounded the crisis initiated by Enlil's departure from Nippur. The Curse of Agade describes how Inanna abandoned Uruk, how Ninhursag withdrew from Kesh, how Enki departed from Eridu, creating a systematic pattern of divine abandonment that affected every major urban center in Mesopotamia. Each deity's withdrawal meant the collapse of the institutional systems centered on their worship, the loss of the specialized knowledge and technical expertise preserved by their priesthoods, and the severing of the divine-human partnership that had sustained urban civilization. The cumulative effect transformed a regional crisis centered on Nippur into an empire-wide catastrophe that threatened the foundations of civilized life throughout Mesopotamia. The psychological and social impacts of divine abandonment extended beyond institutional collapse to affect the fundamental worldview and collective confidence of Mesopotamian populations. In a civilization where every aspect of life was understood to depend on divine favor, and where the gods were believed to actively manage cosmic and earthly affairs, the withdrawal of divine presence created existential crisis that undermined social cohesion and individual motivation. If the gods had abandoned humanity, then the entire framework of meaning that made agricultural labor, craft production, commercial exchange and social cooperation worthwhile collapsed, leaving populations without compelling reasons to maintain the complex behaviors that sustained urban civilization. The text described this demoralization through imagery of people wandering aimlessly, abandoning their fields and workshops, and losing the will to maintain the routines and disciplines that civilized life required. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout southern Mesopotamia reveals a sudden appearance of new cultural materials and settlement patterns around 2150 before Common Era, corresponding precisely with textual accounts of the Gutian invasion described in the Curse of Agade. The Gutians, mountain peoples from the Zagros region to the northeast, had previously existed on the periphery of Mesopotamian civilization as semi-nomadic groups with minimal interaction with the urbanized societies of the plains. Cuneiform texts describe the Gutians as peoples who know no agriculture, who eat raw meat, and who do not bury their dead according to proper customs, emphasizing their status as outsiders who did not share Mesopotamian cultural values or religious practices. Excavations at Girsu, conducted by French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzec in the 1880s, uncovered destruction levels containing distinctive Gutian pottery and weapons, providing physical confirmation of the invasion described in literary sources. The characterization of Gutians in Mesopotamian texts reveals the cultural perspective through which settled agricultural societies viewed pastoral and semi-nomadic populations who maintained different economic systems and social organizations. The emphasis on Gutian ignorance of agriculture highlighted their fundamental difference from Mesopotamian populations, whose entire civilization was built upon intensive irrigation farming that supported dense urban populations. The claim that Gutians consumed raw meat rather than cooked food, a detail that recurs in multiple textual sources, marked them as barbarians who lacked the cultural refinements that distinguish civilized peoples from savages. The assertion that Gutians failed to bury their dead according to proper rituals suggested they lacked the religious sensibilities and concern for cosmic order that governed Mesopotamian society, making them dangerous outsiders who could not be integrated into the existing social fabric. The archaeological evidence for Gutian presence in Mesopotamia appears in distinctive artifact assemblages that differ markedly from indigenous Mesopotamian material culture. Gutian pottery shows handmade construction rather than the wheel-thrown ceramics that had become standard in Mesopotamian urban centres, with surface treatments and decorative motifs that originated in the Zagros highlands rather than the Mesopotamian plains. The ceramic forms themselves serve different functions than typical Mesopotamian vessels, reflecting pastoral subsistence patterns and mobile lifestyles rather than the sedentary agricultural economy that characterized Mesopotamian civilization. Gutian weapons, including distinctive bronze daggers and arrowheads, appear suddenly in archaeological contexts around 2150 before Common Era, marking the arrival of populations equipped with military technology suited to the raiding and warfare that enabled mountain peoples to exploit the wealth accumulated in lowland cities. The destruction levels discovered at Girsu and other sites provide physical evidence of violent conquest that matches the textual descriptions of Gutian invasion. Archaeological excavations revealed burned buildings, scattered human remains showing evidence of violent death, and disrupted stratigraphy indicating rapid abandonment following catastrophic destruction. The ceramic and artifact assemblages immediately overlying these destruction levels show the sudden appearance of Gutian material culture, demonstrating that the invaders established occupation following their military victories. The contrast between the sophisticated urban architecture and elaborate artifact assemblages of the late Akkadian period and the relatively simple material culture of the Gutian occupation layers illustrates the dramatic civilizational regression that accompanied the invasion. The timing of the Gutian invasion corresponded precisely with the period of environmental stress and institutional collapse that followed Naram-Sin's attack on the Ekkha temple. The weakening of Akkadian military power as resources were diverted to manage agricultural crisis, and as administrative systems broke down, created opportunities for peripheral populations to raid and eventually occupy territories they could not have challenged during periods of imperial strength. The withdrawal of Akkadian garrisons from frontier regions as the empire contracted inward to protect its core territories left border areas vulnerable to incursions by mountain peoples who had previously been contained through military deterrence and diplomatic management. The collapse of the trade networks that had channeled resources from the highlands to the lowlands through peaceful exchange may have motivated Gutian raids as mountain populations sought to acquire by force the goods they could no longer obtain. Through commerce. The Gutian occupation of Mesopotamian cities disrupted the sophisticated urban culture that had developed over millennia and imposed simpler social and economic systems more suited to the pastoral backgrounds of the invaders. Administrative tablets from the Gutian period show dramatic simplification of record-keeping practices, with the elaborate bureaucratic systems of the Akkadian Empire replaced by rudimentary accounting that tracked only basic tribute collection and labour mobilization. The monumental architecture and elaborate craft production that had characterized Akkadian urban centers largely ceased as Gutian rulers lacked either the aesthetic sensibilities or the administrative capabilities to support the specialized artisans and complex construction projects that had flourished under earlier regimes. The overall effect was a profound simplification and impoverishment of Mesopotamian civilization that would require generations to overcome. Administrative tablets from the final years of Naram-Sin's reign document a cascading series of environmental and agricultural disasters that devastated Akkadian territories. Described in the Curse of Agade as divine punishment for the king's sacrilege, Tablet CBS 15,947 records dramatic declines in grain yields from previously productive fields, with harvest dropping to less than 30% of normal levels over a 3-year period. The text describes how the fertile soil that had supported Sumerian civilization for millennia suddenly became barren, how irrigation canals dried up despite normal seasonal flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, and how livestock herds succumbed to mysterious diseases that defied all attempts at treatment through traditional veterinary practices known to Mesopotamian farmers. The agricultural crisis documented in these administrative records went far beyond normal variations in crop yields caused by seasonal fluctuations in rainfall or river flooding. The text describes systematic crop failures across vast territories extending from southern Mesopotamia through the northern plains, affecting regions with different microclimates and agricultural systems simultaneously. Barley and wheat, the staple grains that provided the caloric foundation for Mesopotamian civilization, failed to germinate properly or produce stunted plants that yielded only small fractions of normal seed returns. The careful agricultural records maintained by temple administrators, which tracked seed inputs, labour investments, and harvest outputs with mathematical precision, documented productivity collapses that made continued urban life impossible, as cities could not feed their populations from local agricultural production. The irrigation systems that had transformed the Mesopotamian plains into productive agricultural landscapes showed evidence of catastrophic failure during this period. Administrative texts describe canals drying up and becoming clogged with windblown sand, requiring massive labour investments for clearing and maintenance that overwhelmed the available workforce. The sophisticated water management systems that had distributed irrigation water according to carefully calculated schedules and allocations broke down as reduced river flows meant insufficient water to serve all the agricultural lands that depended on artificial irrigation. Conflicts erupted between upstream and downstream users as each community attempted to secure adequate water supplies for their own fields, leading to breaches of canal walls, illegal diversions, and violent confrontations that further disrupted the coordinated management essential for irrigation agriculture. The livestock diseases documented in these texts created additional agricultural crises that compounded the grain harvest failures. Cattle, sheep, and goats, which provided meat, milk, leather, and wool essential to Mesopotamian economy, died in large numbers from ailments that Mesopotamian veterinary knowledge could not diagnose or treat effectively. The texts describe animals refusing to eat, developing fevers and respiratory distress, and dying within days of symptom onset despite all traditional remedies. The loss of draft animals meant that farmers could not plough fields adequately or operate the water-lifting devices necessary for irrigation, creating cascading failures as reduced animal power meant reduced agricultural capacity even when adequate water and viable seed were available. The environmental collapse extended beyond agricultural systems to affect the broader ecological conditions that had made Mesopotamian civilization possible. Texts describe dust storms that darkened the skies and deposited layers of sand and silt across previously productive agricultural lands, transforming irrigated fields into barren landscapes unsuitable for cultivation. The wild game that had supplemented agricultural food production through hunting disappeared from traditional ranges as environmental degradation eliminated the vegetation and water sources that supported wildlife populations. The fish populations in rivers and marshes declined precipitously as changing water conditions made traditional fishing grounds unproductive, eliminating another important food source for urban populations already stressed by grain harvest failures. The 3-year timeline documented in the administrative records reveals the rapidity with which environmental collapse transformed Mesopotamian society. The first year brought reduced harvests that depleted stored reserves accumulated during previous abundant years. forcing rationing and creating food insecurity, but not yet threatening survival. The second year of continued crop failures exhausted remaining reserves and forced populations to consume seed grain that should have been saved for planting, creating a downward spiral as reduced planting meant reduced future harvests, even if conditions improved. The third year brought complete collapse as no reserves remained, as seed grain for planting was unavailable, and as the agricultural infrastructure itself began to deteriorate from lack of maintenance, creating conditions from which recovery would require years or decades, even if environmental conditions returned to normal. Modern paleoclimatic research has identified a severe drought event occurring approximately 4,200 years ago that precisely corresponds with the timeline of Akkadian collapse described in ancient texts. Sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman, analysed by Peter Domenical of Columbia University, revealed dramatic increases in atmospheric dust and aeolian deposits between 2160 and 2130 before Common Era, indicating catastrophic aridification across the Middle East and southwestern Asia. Tree ring data from Anatolian and Iranian sites show abnormally narrow growth rings during this same period, confirming reduced precipitation and environmental stress across the region. The 4.2 kiloyear event, as this climate anomaly is known in geological literature, caused widespread abandonment of agricultural settlements across the Fertile Crescent, matching the environmental catastrophe described in the Curse of Agade with remarkable precision. The sediment core evidence provides objective, quantifiable data about past climate conditions through analysis of materials deposited in marine environments far from human settlements and thus unaffected by cultural biases or historical revisionism. The cores extracted from the Gulf of Oman seafloor contain layers of calcium carbonate shells from marine organisms, wind-blown dust particles transported from land surfaces, and organic materials washed into the ocean by rivers, creating a chronological record of environmental conditions extending back thousands of years. Analysis of dust concentrations in sediment layers dating to the late 3rd millennium before Common Era revealed dramatic spikes indicating massive increases in atmospheric dust loading. A signature of severe drought conditions that desiccated land surfaces and created conditions where wind erosion transported enormous quantities of soil particles into the atmosphere and ultimately deposited them in ocean basins hundreds of kilometers from their source regions. The quantitative measurements from these sediment cores demonstrate the exceptional severity of the 4.2 kiloyear event compared to normal climate variability. The dust concentrations in sediment layers dating to 2150 before Common Era exceeded background levels by factors of 3 to 5, indicating environmental conditions far outside the range of normal seasonal or decadal variations. The sustained nature of the anomaly, extending across several decades according to the sediment chronology, meant that affected regions experienced not a single bad year, but rather a fundamental shift to drier conditions that persisted long enough to destroy agricultural systems adapted to previous climate regimes. The geographical extent of the dust increases, appearing in sediment cores from multiple locations across the northern Indian Ocean, indicates that the drought affected the entire Middle East and southwestern Asia simultaneously, rather than being a localized phenomenon. The tree ring evidence provides independent confirmation of the drought event through analysis of annual growth rings in long-lived trees from Anatolia and the Iranian plateau. Trees produce wider rings during years of abundant moisture when growing conditions are favourable, and narrower rings during drought years when water stress limits growth. Dendrochronological sequences constructed from overlapping tree ring patterns create continuous records extending back thousands of years, allowing precise dating of past environmental conditions to individual years. Analysis of Anatolian juniper and Iranian oak trees revealed sequences of extremely narrow rings centered on 2150 before Common Era, indicating severe water stress that persisted for multiple consecutive years. The tree ring data provides annual resolution that complements the lower resolution sediment core records, revealing the precise timing and duration of drought conditions. The narrowest rings appear in sequences dating to between 2160 and 2140 before Common Era, corresponding exactly to the timeline of Akkadian collapse, documented in cuneiform administrative tablets. The sequential nature of narrow rings, appearing in consecutive annual layers rather than as isolated events, confirms that the drought persisted for at least 2 decades. creating sustained environmental stress that overwhelmed agricultural systems designed to buffer against single-year crop failures. The recovery pattern visible in gradually widening rings after 2140. Before Common Era indicates that climate conditions slowly improved during the early Ur-3 period, enabling the agricultural revival that supported Mesopotamian recovery. The convergence of evidence from cuneiform texts, sediment cores, and tree rings demonstrates remarkable correlation between ancient historical accounts and modern scientific data. The environmental catastrophe that Mesopotamian scribes attributed to divine punishment for Naram-Sin sacrilege corresponds precisely with a major climate anomaly documented through multiple independent lines of paleoclimatic evidence. This correlation validates the historical accuracy of Mesopotamian textual accounts, while providing scientific explanation for events that ancient writers understood through religious frameworks. The 4.2 kiloyear event appears as one of the most significant climate anomalies of the Holocene epoch, causing civilizational collapses not only in Mesopotamia, but also in Egypt, where it corresponds with the end of the Old Kingdom, and in the Indus Valley, where it may have contributed to the decline of Harappan urban civilization. Excavations at Tell Leilan in northeastern Syria, conducted by Harvey Weiss of Yale University, between 1978 and 2010 revealed dramatic evidence of sudden urban abandonment, precisely corresponding to the Akkadian collapse period. The site, identified as the ancient city of Shinar, which served as a major Akkadian administrative centre, shows a distinct stratum of wind-blown dust and sand overlying the final occupation level, indicating the city was abandoned and subsequently buried by desert conditions that transformed previously agricultural land into arid steppe. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the abandonment layer confirms the event occurred between 2160 and 2140 before Common Era. Similar 40 before Common Era. Similar abandonment patterns appear at sites throughout the Kabur River Valley, the Jazira region, and across northern Mesopotamia, demonstrating that the environmental collapse described in textual sources affected the entire Akkadian imperial domain simultaneously. The stratigraphy at Tell Leilan provides unusually clear physical evidence of rapid urban abandonment, caused by environmental change rather than military conquest or gradual economic decline. The final Akkadian occupation level contains intact buildings with roofs collapsed inward, pottery and tools left in place as if residents departed expecting to return, and no evidence of the destruction by fire or deliberate demolition that would indicate enemy attack. Immediately overlying this occupation surface appears a layer of wind-blown sediment approximately 30 centimeters thick, composed of fine dust and sand particles that accumulated gradually over the abandoned ruins. The sediment layer contains no cultural materials, pottery sherds, or other evidence of human presence, indicating the site remained completely uninhabited, while environmental processes buried the ruins under desert deposits. The sedimentological analysis of the abandonment layer reveals environmental conditions dramatically different from those that had prevailed when the city was occupied. The particle size distribution of the sediments indicates deposition by wind rather than water, demonstrating that the regional climate had shifted from conditions supporting irrigation agriculture to arid conditions where wind erosion and dust deposition dominated landscape processes. The mineralogical composition of the dust particles shows they originated from exposed soil surfaces in the surrounding region rather than from distant sources, indicating that local agricultural lands had lost their protective vegetation cover and were subject to deflation by wind. The thickness and uniform nature of the deposit indicate that these desert conditions persisted for decades, accumulating sediment gradually until the ruins were partially buried. The radiocarbon dates from Tell Leilan provide precise chronological control that links the abandonment directly to the 4.2 kiloyear climate event and the Akkadian collapse. Charcoal samples from the final occupation level yielded dates clustering around 2160 before Common Era, establishing when the city was last inhabited. Organic materials from the base of the abandonment layer produced dates around 2150 before Common Era, indicating when the environmental deterioration began. The absence of any radiocarbon dates from within the abandonment layer itself confirms that the site remained uninhabited throughout the period when the dust and sand accumulated. Dates from the reoccupation level above the abandonment layer cluster around 2100 before Common Era, indicating the site remained abandoned for approximately 50 years before populations returned when climate conditions improved. The regional pattern of synchronous abandonment extends far beyond Tell Leilan to encompass the entire northern Mesopotamian plains and the upper Euphrates Valley. Survey projects that recorded hundreds of archaeological sites across this vast region documented dramatic population declines during the late 3rd millennium before Common Era, with the majority of settlements occupied during the Akkadian period, showing abandonment around 2150 before Common Era. The settlement pattern shifted from dispersed agricultural villages and small towns distributed across the plains to concentrated populations in a few fortified centres located along major rivers, where water supplies remained more reliable. The total occupied area within the region declined by approximately 75%, indicating either massive population loss through mortality and migration or extreme nucleation, as survivors concentrated in the few locations where continued habitation remained possible. The sophisticated irrigation networks that had sustained Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia show evidence of sudden failure and abandonment during the Akkadian collapse period. Archaeological surveys in the Diyala River Valley conducted by Thorkild Jacobson and Robert Adams in the 1950s revealed that canal systems that had functioned continuously for centuries were abruptly abandoned around 2150 before Common Era, with many showing evidence of deliberate destruction through breaching of canal walls and demolition of water control structures. Cuneiform administrative texts from Girsu document the collapse of coordinated water management, as local officials abandoned centralized planning in favor of desperate attempts to secure water supplies for their immediate territories, leading to conflicts between neighboring cities over increasingly scarce water resources. The irrigation systems of ancient Mesopotamia represented engineering achievements of extraordinary sophistication that had transformed arid plains into productive agricultural landscapes, supporting dense urban populations. The networks consisted of major canals extending dozens of kilometres from rivers to agricultural districts, secondary distribution channels that delivered water to individual field systems, and elaborate drainage networks that prevented waterlogging and salinisation of irrigated soils. The construction and maintenance of these systems required massive labour investments, sophisticated surveying techniques to ensure proper gradients for water flow, and coordinated administrative management to allocate water resources fairly among competing users. The successful operation of irrigation agriculture depended absolutely on maintaining these physical infrastructures and the institutional frameworks that governed their use. The archaeological evidence from the Diyala Valley provides detailed documentation of irrigation system collapse through surveys that mapped hundreds of kilometres of ancient canals and analysed their construction phases, periods of use, and abandonment sequences. The surveys identified canal segments through aerial photography that revealed linear soil discolorations marking buried channels, ground reconnaissance that located surface traces of ancient waterworks, and excavation of canal cross-sections that exposed construction details and stratigraphic sequences. The canal system showed continuous use and periodic reconstruction across multiple centuries during the early dynastic and Akkadian periods, with regular maintenance evidenced by repeated episodes of dredging, wall repair, and channel realignment. This pattern of sustained use and careful maintenance ended abruptly around 2150, before Common Era, when the canals were abandoned and left to silt up and erode. The evidence for deliberate destruction of irrigation infrastructure appears in excavated canal segments that show intentional breaching of embankments and systematic demolition of water control structures. At several locations, excavations reveal that canal walls had been deliberately cut through, creating breaches that would have drained water from the channels and rendered them useless for irrigation purposes. The regularity and positioning of these breaches indicate they resulted from human action, rather than natural erosion or flooding events, suggesting deliberate sabotage by communities attempting to divert water to their own territories or to deny resources to rivals. Water control structures, including weirs, sluice gates, and distribution basins, showed evidence of systematic dismantlement, with cut stones removed and foundation structures damaged beyond easy repair. The administrative texts from Girsu document the institutional collapse that accompanied the physical breakdown of irrigation systems. Early Akkadian period tablets record sophisticated coordinated management systems where regional water administrators allocated irrigation supplies according to standardized protocols, maintained schedules for canal maintenance and cleaning, and adjudicated disputes between users according to established legal principles. These tablets show systematic record-keeping that tracked water deliveries, documented labour contributions to maintenance work, and recorded agreements about water sharing during periods of shortage. The final Akkadian period tablets reveal complete breakdown of these coordinated systems as local officials ceased cooperating with regional authorities and instead pursued independent strategies to secure water for their immediate districts. The escalation of water conflicts appears clearly in legal documents and administrative correspondence that describe violent confrontations between neighbouring communities over irrigation resources. Texts record incidents where upstream communities illegally diverted water that should have flowed to downstream users, where farmers destroyed channels supplying rival settlements, and where armed conflicts erupted over control of canal headworks and distribution points. The traditional legal mechanisms for resolving such disputes, which depended on appeals to regional authorities and enforcement through centralized power, ceased functioning as the Akkadian administrative system collapsed. The resulting chaos created conditions where might replaced right as the basis for water allocation, leading to cycles of retaliation and escalating violence that further disrupted agricultural production. The collapse of irrigation systems created self-reinforcing cycles of decline that accelerated agricultural crisis beyond what climate conditions alone would have produced. Abandoned canals silted up rapidly without regular dredging, making them increasingly difficult to restore even when adequate water became available. The breaching and destruction of water control infrastructure meant that even communities with access to water could not distribute it effectively to agricultural fields. The breakdown of coordinated management eliminated the information systems and enforcement mechanisms necessary for fair allocation during scarcity, leading to conflicts that consumed resources and labour that could have been invested in maintaining remaining functional infrastructure. The cumulative effect transformed irrigation systems that had sustained civilization for millennia into useless ruins that would require enormous investments to reconstruct. Administrative archives from Girsu and Umma document the complete breakdown of the Akkadian trading system that had connected Mesopotamia with distant regions including Anatolia, the Persian Gulf, and the Indus Valley. Tablets from the final years of Naram-Sin's reign show dramatic declines in imports of essential materials including timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and tin from sources in Iran or Central Asia. Tablet Qusas 35 records the last documented shipment of goods from Dilmun, the trading centre on Bahrain Island, after which all references to Gulf trade disappear from the administrative record for several generations. The collapse of these trading networks meant that Akkadian workshops could no longer obtain raw materials necessary for craft production, causing cascading failures in manufacturing sectors that had employed thousands of workers in urban centres throughout the empire. The Akkadian trading system had created economic integration across vast territories through regular exchange of materials that were locally abundant in some regions, but scarce or absent in others. Mesopotamia itself lacked timber suitable for construction, stone for building and sculpture, and metallic ores necessary for bronze production, making the civilization fundamentally dependent on imports from distant sources to sustain urban life and craft production. The empire's wealth derived partly from its position controlling trade routes that connected resource-rich highlands with the productive agricultural plains, allowing Akkadian merchants and administrators to profit from facilitating exchange between regions with complementary resources. The security and administrative efficiency provided by imperial governance had reduced transaction costs and risks associated with long-distance trade, enabling commercial networks to flourish and expand. The administrative tablets documenting trade volumes provide quantitative evidence of the commercial collapse. Early Akkadian period records from Girsu show regular imports of Lebanese cedar beams arriving in shipments of hundreds of timbers, sufficient to support major construction projects and to supply workshops producing furniture, boats, and other wooden goods. Tablets from Naram-Sin's final years record dramatic declines in timber shipments, with total annual imports dropping to less than 20% of earlier volumes. Similar patterns appear in records of metal imports, with copper and tin shipments declining precipitously during the final Akkadian years. The combination of reduced copper and tin supplies meant that bronze production, which required both metals in specific ratios, became impossible to sustain at previous levels. The luxury goods trade documented in temple and palace archives shows even more dramatic collapse than trade in utilitarian materials. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, which had reached Mesopotamia through multiple intermediary traders across thousands of kilometers, ceased arriving during the final Akkadian period. The brilliant blue stone had been used extensively in elite jewellery, royal regalia, and temple decoration, with archaeological contexts from earlier periods containing thousands of lapis beads and carved objects. The disappearance of new lapis supplies meant that craftsmen could not produce the luxury goods that had been central to displays of wealth and power by royal and religious elites. Similar patterns affected trade in carnelian from India, precious woods from distant forests, and exotic stones used in palace and temple decoration. The tablet recording the final shipment from Dilmun provides poignant documentation of the moment when long-established trade connections severed. Dilmun, located on Bahrain Island in the Persian Gulf, had served for centuries as an entrepot where Mesopotamian merchants met traders from Oman bringing copper, from India bringing carnelian and exotic woods, and from unknown sources bringing materials that were transshipped through the Gulf trading network. The tablet describes a shipment of copper and dates arriving from Dilmun, received and processed through normal administrative procedures and recorded in the standard format used for such transactions. After this tablet, administrative archives contain no further references to Dilmun trade for over a century, indicating complete cessation of commercial contact with the Gulf region. The collapse of trade networks created cascading economic failures throughout Akkadian urban centres. Workshops that had employed specialised craftsmen in metallurgy, woodworking, jewellery production, and textile manufacture ceased operations when raw materials became unavailable. The workers who had supported themselves through craft production lost their livelihoods and either migrated elsewhere seeking opportunities or shifted to agricultural labour if land remained available. The urban populations that had been supported by commercial activity and craft production could no longer sustain themselves in cities that had grown far beyond the carrying capacity of immediately adjacent agricultural lands. The tax revenues that had supported royal administration and temple institutions declined drastically as the productive economy contracted, creating fiscal crises that undermined governmental capacity precisely when effective leadership was most needed. Legal documents and administrative correspondence from the late Akkadian period reveal escalating social disorder as central authority collapsed and local institutions failed to maintain order. Tablet CBS 19,843 describes banditry on major roads, attacks on merchant caravans, and the breakdown of judicial systems that had previously maintained law and security across the empire. The text records how travellers could no longer safely move between cities, how agricultural settlements were abandoned as farmers fled to fortified urban centres seeking protection, and how previously productive agricultural land reverted to wilderness as the rural population collapsed. Court records from Girsu document increasing numbers of cases involving theft, assault, and property disputes that local authorities lacked resources to adjudicate properly, leading to a collapse of legal order and the emergence of private violence as the primary means of resolving conflicts. The maintenance of public order in complex societies depends on effective institutions that can enforce laws, adjudicate disputes, and punish wrongdoing through legitimate authority that citizens recognize as binding. The Akkadian Empire had developed sophisticated legal systems that operated through networks of courts, staffed by trained judges who applied standardized legal codes and could call upon military and police forces to enforce their judgments. The legitimacy of this system rested ultimately on the power and authority of the central government, which provided the coercive capacity necessary to compel compliance with legal decisions and the administrative infrastructure needed to investigate crimes, collect evidence, and prosecute wrongdoers systematically. When central authority weakened and administrative systems collapsed, the entire framework of legal order began to disintegrate. The accounts of banditry and caravan attacks reveal how the breakdown of security transformed previously safe trade routes into dangerous territories where armed groups operated with impunity. The major roads connecting Mesopotamian cities had been maintained and patrolled by imperial authorities, who ensured that merchants could transport goods without facing robbery or extortion. The withdrawal of these security forces as the empire contracted created power vacuums that opportunistic groups quickly exploited. Former soldiers who had lost their positions when military units disbanded displaced farmers who had lost their lands to environmental collapse, and adventurers attracted by opportunities for predation formed armed bands that preyed on travellers and isolated settlements. The vulnerability of merchant caravans carrying valuable trade goods made them particularly attractive targets for these bandit groups. The abandonment of agricultural settlements documented in the administrative texts reflects rational responses by rural populations to deteriorating security conditions. Dispersed farming villages that had been viable during periods of effective governance became untenable when banditry made the countryside dangerous and when no authority existed that could protect isolated communities from attack. Farm families faced choices between remaining on their lands and risking violence, or abandoning their fields and seeking safety in fortified urban centres, where walls and concentrated populations provided some protection against raiders. The texts describe this rural exodus in matter-of-fact administrative language, recording villages that had ceased sending tax payments, fields that had reverted to wilderness, and populations that had relocated to cities, creating refugee crises that overwhelmed urban resources. The court records from Girsu provide detailed documentation of legal system collapse through their cataloguing of cases that officials proved unable to resolve effectively. The tablets record disputes over property boundaries where neither party could produce witnesses or documents proving ownership because records had been lost or destroyed during disruptions. They describe assault cases where victims sought justice, but courts lacked means to apprehend accused perpetrators who had fled to other jurisdictions or joined bandit groups beyond governmental control. They document theft complaints where stolen property could not be recovered and thieves could not be punished because enforcement mechanisms had broken down. The accumulation of unresolved cases created backlog that overwhelmed judicial capacity and undermined public confidence in legal institutions. The emergence of private violence as the primary means of conflict. Resolution appears in texts describing family feuds, vigilante actions, and community-level armed conflicts that replaced formal legal processes. When courts could not provide justice, aggrieved parties took matters into their own hands, leading to cycles of retaliation that escalated conflicts and created new grievances. Communities that could not rely on external authorities for protection organised local defence forces and resolved internal disputes through community councils operating outside formal legal frameworks. The proliferation of these informal mechanisms for maintaining order and resolving conflicts demonstrated both the collapse of centralised authority and the fundamental human need for some system of justice and security even when official institutions failed. Archaeological evidence from sites across southern Mesopotamia reveals a dramatic change in material culture corresponding to the Gutian occupation period described in textual sources, pottery assemblages from occupation levels dating to 2150 through 2120. Before Common Era show the appearance of distinctive Gutian ceramic forms previously unknown in Mesopotamian contexts, including handmade vessels with distinctive surface treatments and decorative motifs that originated in the Zagros mountain regions. Excavations at Adab conducted by Edgar James Banks in 1903 uncovered a destruction level containing Gutian weapons and personal ornaments overlying the final Akkadian occupation phase, providing direct evidence of violent conquest. The Gutian material culture shows minimal adoption of Mesopotamian artistic traditions or technological practices, indicating the invaders maintained their distinct cultural identity rather than assimilating into the conquered civilization. The ceramic evidence provides the clearest archaeological signature of Gutian presence through distinctive vessel forms and manufacturing techniques that differ fundamentally from Mesopotamian pottery traditions. Mesopotamian potters had used the wheel for ceramic production since the late 4th millennium before Common Era, creating standardized vessel shapes with uniform wall thickness and smooth surfaces that reflected centralized craft production by specialized artisans. Gutian pottery shows hand-building techniques including coiling and slab construction that produced vessels with irregular profiles, variable wall thickness, and surface irregularities characteristic of household production by non-specialists. The vessel forms themselves served different functional purposes than typical Mesopotamian ceramics, including portable water containers suitable for mobile pastoral lifestyles and cooking pots designed for direct fire heating rather than the indirect heating methods preferred in Mesopotamian cuisine. The decorative treatments applied to Gutian pottery employ motifs and techniques derived from Zagros Mountain artistic traditions rather than Mesopotamian decorative systems. The vessels feature incised geometric patterns including zigzags, cross-hatching, and angular designs that appear commonly in highland ceramic traditions, but were rare or absent in lowland Mesopotamian pottery. The surface treatments include distinctive burnishing techniques that created lustrous finishes through careful polishing of leather-hard clay surfaces, a decorative approach that differed from the painted decorations or applied reliefs typical of Mesopotamian ceramic art. The overall aesthetic reflected different cultural values and artistic sensibilities than those that had governed Mesopotamian craft production. The weapons and personal ornaments found in Gutian occupation contexts provide additional material evidence of distinct cultural identity maintained by the invaders. Bronze daggers from these contexts show blade forms and handle constructions that originated in mountain metalworking traditions, with tanned blades designed for insertion into separate handles, rather than the cast integral hilts characteristic of Mesopotamian weapons. Personal ornaments, including bronze pins, beads, and decorative fittings, employ design elements and manufacturing techniques distinct from Mesopotamian jewelry traditions. The presence of these distinctively non-Mesopotamian artifacts in occupation levels demonstrates that Gutian populations retained their material culture traditions, rather than adopting the artistic and technological practices of the civilization they had conquered. The destruction level at Adab provides dramatic physical evidence of violent conquest that marked the transition from Akkadian to Gutian control. The excavations revealed a burned building complex containing collapsed mud brick walls, charred wooden roof beams, and a debris field of shattered pottery and broken furnishings that indicated rapid destruction by fire. Human skeletal remains found within the destruction debris showed evidence of violent trauma, including fractured skulls and severed limbs, demonstrating that the site's inhabitants had suffered violent deaths during the destruction event. The stratigraphy showed that immediately following this destruction, new occupation began characterized by the distinctive Gutian material culture, indicating that the invaders established control immediately after their military victory. The minimal cultural assimilation evidenced in Gutian occupation layers reveals the fundamental difference between this invasion and earlier conquests, where victorious groups had typically adopted the sophisticated urban culture of Mesopotamian civilization. Previous conquerors, including the Akkadians themselves, had embraced Sumerian cultural traditions, adopted cuneiform writing, patronized traditional religious institutions, and maintained the craft production and architectural traditions that characterized Mesopotamian urban life. The Gutians instead maintained their distinct cultural identity, continuing to produce handmade pottery, use weapons and ornaments of highland design, and presumably maintain social and economic organization patterns derived from their pastoral mountain origins, rather than adapting to Mesopotamian urban systems. Despite over a century of intensive archaeological investigation, the location of Akkad itself remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries, suggesting the city's destruction was so complete that its very location was lost to later generations. Ancient Babylonian texts describe Akkad's general location as being near Kish and Babylon in northern Babylonia, but provide insufficient detail for precise identification. 19th and 20th century archaeologists proposed numerous candidates, including Tel Muhammad, Ishchali, and sites in the vicinity of Baghdad, but none produced convincing evidence of Akkadian imperial architecture or administrative archives that would confirm identification as Sargon's capital. The total disappearance of such a major urban centre suggests destruction, on a scale rarely encountered in archaeological contexts, supporting textual accounts of complete annihilation as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's sacrilege. The search for Akkad has engaged archaeologists since the beginning of scientific investigation of Mesopotamian sites in the mid-19th century. Early explorers recognized that locating the capital of the world's first empire would be among the most significant archaeological discoveries possible, promising to reveal monumental architecture, royal archives, and material culture that would illuminate a crucial period in human history. The general geographical parameters provided by ancient texts seem to offer sufficient guidance for identification, as multiple sources placed Akkad in the region between the ancient cities of Kish and Babylon in northern Babylonia, an area extensively surveyed and excavated during the 20th century. The failure to identify the site despite intensive investigation of this region represents one of archaeology's most frustrating mysteries. The proposed candidate sites have each shown promising features that initially suggested possible identification as Akkad, but ultimately failed to produce convincing confirmatory evidence. Tell Muhammad, located northwest of Baghdad, was investigated as a potential Akkad location due to its size and its position in the appropriate geographical region. Excavations revealed substantial occupation during the Akkadian period, but the architectural remains and artifact assemblages matched patterns typical of provincial centres, rather than showing the monumental construction and imperial administrative infrastructure expected for the empire's capital. Ishchali and other sites in the Diyala Valley were similarly investigated based on geographical considerations, but none produced the distinctive evidence of imperial functions that would confirm identification as Akkad. The archaeological criteria for identifying Akkad would include several distinctive features that should differentiate the imperial capital from provincial cities. The site should show monumental palatial architecture of unprecedented scale and sophistication reflecting the seat of imperial power. It should contain massive administrative archives with tens of thousands of tablets documenting governance of far-flung territories. It should display evidence of workshops producing royal monuments and luxury goods for elite consumption. It should show concentrations of imported materials and foreign artifacts reflecting the capital's position at the centre of far-reaching trade networks. The stratigraphic sequence should include a dramatic destruction level, corresponding to the late Akkadian collapse followed by abandonment or drastically reduced occupation. No investigated site has demonstrated this combination of features. The possibility that Akkad's location has been completely lost suggests destruction so thorough that the site was rendered unrecognisable, or that its remains lie beneath modern occupation that prevents archaeological investigation. The Curse of Agade describes utter annihilation of the city, with its buildings reduced to rubble, its population scattered or killed, and its very foundations cursed so that it would never be rebuilt. If this literary account preserves genuine historical memory, the archaeological remains of Akkad might consist of heavily eroded ruins that have lost all monumental features and that contain no standing architecture or surface artifacts that would enable identification without extensive excavation. Alternatively, the site might lie beneath modern Baghdad or other contemporary cities, where archaeological investigation is impossible or severely restricted. The symbolic significance of Akkad's disappearance extends beyond the practical challenges it poses for archaeology to encompass its role in Mesopotamian historical consciousness. The complete loss of such a significant city served as tangible evidence of the catastrophic consequences that could follow violations of cosmic order, providing object lessons about divine power and human limitations that resonated through subsequent millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. The impossibility of locating Akkad made the city into a powerful symbol of transience and divine judgment, reminding later generations that even the mightiest human achievements could be obliterated utterly when they transgressed against sacred law. The Curse of Agade exists in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 500 years after the events it describes, indicating the text was considered important enough to preserve through continuous copying and transmission across many generations. The consistency of the narrative across different manuscript versions and the precision of its historical details suggest it was based on contemporary records and eyewitness accounts that were preserved in temple archives at Nippur. Linguistic analysis of the text reveals it was composed in classical Sumerian rather than Akkadian, suggesting it originated in the Sumerian religious establishment that preserved records of Naram-Sin sacrilege and the subsequent collapse as a warning to future rulers about the consequences of violating sacred law. The text's survival through multiple political transitions and cultural changes demonstrates how ancient scribal institutions preserved historical memory through literary frameworks that ensured important events would be remembered and transmitted to subsequent civilizations. The existence of multiple manuscript copies from the Old Babylonian period provides crucial evidence about the text's transmission and preservation across 5 centuries of Mesopotamian history. At least 11 separate tablets containing portions of the Curse of Agade have been recovered from archaeological contexts at sites including Nippur, Ur, and Sippar, all dating to the early 2nd millennium before Common Era. These copies show remarkable textual consistency, with variations limited primarily to minor orthographic differences and occasional scribal errors, rather than substantial narrative divergences. The uniformity across manuscripts indicates that scribes worked from authoritative master copies and followed established protocols for accurate reproduction, maintaining textual integrity across multiple copying generations. The precision of historical details preserved in the text argues strongly against dismissing it as purely mythological invention, composed centuries after the events. The Curse of Agade contains specific references to administrative practices, agricultural systems, trade networks, and institutional arrangements that are confirmed by contemporary Akkadian period administrative tablets, but that would have been difficult or impossible for Old Babylonian scribes to reconstruct accurately without access to older source materials. The text's descriptions of irrigation failures, trade disruptions, and social breakdown match archaeological evidence from Akkadian collapse contexts with remarkable accuracy, suggesting the narrative preserved genuine historical memories rather than reflecting old Babylonian period conditions or purely imaginative reconstruction. The linguistic characteristics of the text reveal important information about its origins and purposes. The composition employs classical Sumerian language forms and literary conventions that were already archaic by the Old Babylonian period when the surviving copies were produced. The vocabulary includes technical terms for religious practices, administrative procedures, and agricultural operations that derive from earlier historical periods and that would have required specialized knowledge to use correctly. The poetic structure follows sophisticated metrical patterns and employs literary devices including parallelism, repetition, and vivid imagery that characterize Sumerian religious and historical literature from earlier periods. These linguistic features indicate the text was originally composed in Sumerian during or shortly after the Akkadian period, rather than being a later Babylonian composition translated into archaic language. The composition's origins in the Sumerian religious establishment appear clearly in its theological perspective and institutional concerns. The text treats Enlil's temple at Nippur as the cosmic center, whose violation triggered universal catastrophe, reflecting the viewpoint of Nippur's priesthood, who claimed supreme religious authority throughout Mesopotamian history. The emphasis on proper ritual observance, respect for divine prerogatives, and the catastrophic consequences of sacrilege encodes religious principles that serve the interests of temple institutions by establishing strict limits on royal power and asserting divine authority over human rulers. The preservation of this narrative in temple archives ensured it would be available to instruct future kings about the boundaries they must respect and the deference they must show to religious establishments. The text's function as a warning to rulers appears explicitly in its literary structure and thematic emphasis. The narrative follows a clear causal sequence showing how Naram-Sin's specific acts of sacrilege led inexorably to specific forms of divine punishment that destroyed his civilization. The detailed descriptions of agricultural collapse, social breakdown, and foreign invasion serve as object lessons about the consequences that await rulers who violate sacred law, regardless of their military power or administrative capabilities. The complete destruction of Akkad itself, presented as permanent and irreversible, demonstrates that no human achievement can withstand divine retribution once sacred boundaries have been transgressed. This didactic purpose ensured the text's continued relevance and motivated its preservation across changing political circumstances. The survival of the Curse of Agade, through multiple political transitions, demonstrates the institutional continuity and professional dedication of Mesopotamian scribal schools. The text was preserved through the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the Gutian occupation, the Ur-III revival, the Isin-Larsa period, and the rise of Babylonian power, spanning nearly a millennium of political instability and cultural change. Temple archives maintained by hereditary scribal families ensured that important texts were protected, copied, and transmitted even when ruling dynasties changed and when cities faced conquest or abandonment. The professional pride and institutional memory of scribal communities motivated preservation efforts that transcended immediate political circumstances and that prioritized long-term cultural continuity over short-term expediency. Archaeological evidence from Ur, Uruk and Nippur reveals that Mesopotamian civilization began recovering from the Akkadian collapse around 2112 before Common Era under the Third Dynasty of Ur, founded by Ur-Nammu, who expelled the Gutians and re-established native Sumerian rule. Administrative tablets from this period show systematic efforts to restore irrigation systems, rebuild temple complexes, and re-establish trading networks that had collapsed during the Gutian occupation. Significantly, the Ur-3 kings demonstrated extreme reverence for Enlil's temple at Nippur, undertaking major renovation projects and providing lavish offerings in what appears to be a conscious effort to avoid repeating Naram-Sin's fatal error. Royal inscriptions from Ur-Nammu and his successors emphasize their piety and their careful observance of proper ritual protocols, suggesting they had internalized the lessons preserved in texts like the Curse of Agade about the catastrophic consequences of disrespecting the gods. The founding of the Third Dynasty of Ur marked a deliberate break with the Gutian occupation and a conscious revival of Sumerian cultural traditions that had been disrupted during the collapse period. Ur-Nammu, the dynasty's founder, presented himself as a liberator who had expelled foreign invaders and restored legitimate Sumerian governance to Mesopotamia. His royal inscriptions emphasize his Sumerian identity and his commitment to traditional religious and cultural values, distancing his regime from both the Gutian occupiers and from the Akkadian kings whose hubris had brought catastrophe. The dynasty's name itself, the Third Dynasty of Ur, invoked the city's glorious past while positioning the new regime as heir to earlier Sumerian achievements, rather than to Akkadian imperial ambitions. The administrative tablets from the Ur-3 period document systematic reconstruction efforts that address the multiple forms of collapse that had devastated Mesopotamian civilization. Records from Girsu, Umma, and other provincial centers show organized programs to restore irrigation infrastructure through coordinated labor mobilization that dredged silted canals, repaired breached embankments, and reconstructed water control structures. The tablets record detailed planning for these projects, including calculations of labor requirements, schedules for completion of different canal segments, and allocation of resources necessary for successful reconstruction. The scale and coordination of these efforts demonstrate effective central administration that could mobilize resources across wide territories and implement long-term development programs. The temple reconstruction programs undertaken by Ur-3 kings reveal priorities that differed markedly from Akkadian period building activities. Rather than focusing resources on palaces and administrative buildings that glorified royal power, the Ur-3 rulers invested heavily in restoring and enhancing religious structures that had been neglected or damaged during the collapse period. Royal inscriptions from Ur-Nammu describe major renovation projects at the Akkad temple at Nippur, emphasizing the king's devotion to Enlil and his commitment to restoring proper worship at the supreme god's earthly dwelling. The inscriptions detail specific construction activities including rebuilding the temple's foundation platform, reconstructing its walls and gates, and providing new furnishings and ritual equipment for divine service. The lavish offerings provided to temples by Ur III, kings appear in administrative records that document transfers of precious metals, luxury goods, and agricultural products to religious institutions. Tablets record deliveries of gold and silver in quantities measured in hundreds of kilograms, shipments of fine textiles including elaborate garments for cult statues, and regular allocations of grain, livestock, and other provisions to support temple personnel and ritual activities. The generosity of royal patronage far exceeded the minimum necessary to maintain basic religious functions, suggesting deliberate efforts to demonstrate piety and to establish positive relationships with religious institutions whose support was essential for political legitimacy. The emphasis on ritual propriety in Ur-3 royal inscriptions reflects conscious awareness of religious obligations and determination to avoid the errors that had destroyed the Akkadian Empire. The inscriptions describe kings performing elaborate purification rituals before approaching temples, consulting omens carefully before undertaking major projects, and meticulously observing festival calendars and ritual procedures. Ur-Nammu's law code, the earliest known legal compilation in history, begins with declarations of the king's devotion to the gods and his commitment to justice and proper order, framing legal authority as deriving from divine mandate rather than from independent royal power. This rhetorical positioning established clear theological frameworks that subordinated kingship to divine authority. The restoration of trading networks during the Ur-3 period appears in administrative archives that document resumption of commercial contacts with distant regions. Tablets record imports of copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, indicating that the long-distance trade routes disrupted during the Akkadian collapse had been re-established. The volume of trade documented in Ur-3 archives approached and eventually exceeded Akkadian period levels, demonstrating successful economic recovery that restored Mesopotamian access to essential raw materials. The administrative mechanisms managing this trade showed sophisticated development, including standardized contracts, quality control procedures, and accounting systems that tracked goods through complex distribution networks. The Akkadian collapse marked a permanent shift in Mesopotamian royal ideology regarding the divine status of kings. While Naram-Sin and his immediate successors had claimed actual divinity, later Mesopotamian rulers reverted to the earlier model where kings served as intermediaries between gods and humans rather than claiming divine status themselves. Royal inscriptions from the Ur-3 period and subsequent dynasties consistently describe kings as chosen servants of the gods rather than gods themselves, indicating that Naram-Sin's fate served as a permanent warning against royal hubris. The only exception to this pattern was Shulgi, second king of the Ur-3 dynasty, who did claim divine status but took great care to demonstrate his piety through massive temple-building programs and elaborate ritual observances, suggesting he understood the need to balance royal pretensions with genuine religious devotion. The ideological shift away from divine kingship represented a fundamental reordering of political theology that would influence Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. The pre-Akkadian model of kingship, which prevailed among Sumerian city-states, portrayed rulers as humans chosen by gods to maintain order and ensure prosperity, acting as shepherds of their people under divine supervision. Kings derive their authority from divine selection rather than from inherent divine nature, making them accountable to gods whose favour they must maintain through proper conduct and ritual observance. Naram-Sin's assertion of actual divinity had challenged this framework by positioning the king as an object of worship rather than as a worshipper, eliminating the theological basis for limiting royal power through appeals to divine law. The return to the earlier model after the Akkadian collapse re-established theological frameworks that constrained royal authority and provided institutional bases for challenging kings who violated sacred law or traditional customs. If kings were merely human servants of the gods rather than divine beings themselves, then their commands could be evaluated against divine law and resisted when they conflicted with religious principles. Temple priesthoods could claim authority to interpret divine will and to judge whether royal actions accorded with cosmic order, providing checks on arbitrary exercise of power. The political theology of divine mandate rather than divine kingship created space for institutional pluralism where religious and political authorities maintained separate spheres of influence and competed for legitimacy. The rhetorical strategies employed in Ur-3 royal inscriptions demonstrate conscious adoption of humble language that emphasize service rather than domination. The inscriptions describe kings as shepherds chosen to care for their people, as servants appointed to execute divine commands, and as priests responsible for maintaining proper worship and ritual observance. This language contrasted sharply with Akkadian period royal rhetoric that had emphasized conquest, domination, and the king's supreme authority over human and divine realms. The Ur-3 inscriptions portrayed kingship as a burden and responsibility requiring constant attention to divine will rather than as a privilege conferring unlimited power. The exception represented by Shulgi's divine kingship reveals the complexity of royal ideology during the Ur-3 period, and the strategies kings employed to navigate between claims to special status and awareness of religious constraints. Shulgi ruled for 48 years from approximately 2094 to 2047 before Common Era, achieving military victories that expanded Ur's territory and implementing administrative reforms that strengthened central authority. His adoption of divine status came relatively late in his reign, appearing in inscriptions only after he had established secure power and demonstrated commitment to traditional religious values through decades of pious conduct and lavish temple patronage. The careful balancing act Shulgi performed between divine pretensions and religious devotion appears clearly in his building inscriptions and hymnic compositions. The king claimed divine status and demanded worship at temples dedicated to his cult throughout the empire, yet simultaneously sponsored massive construction projects that enhanced traditional temples and increased offerings to established deities. His hymns praise his own divine qualities, while also proclaiming his devotion to Enlil, Inanna and other gods, positioning himself within rather than above the divine hierarchy. This theological positioning allowed Shulgi to enjoy the enhanced authority that came from divine status, while avoiding the appearance of challenging established gods or claiming independence from divine law. The ultimate failure of Shulgi's dynasty, despite his careful religious observances, demonstrated that even properly managed divine kingship could not ensure lasting success. The Ur-3 Empire collapsed approximately 150 years after its founding, destroyed by Elamite invasion and internal rebellions that fragmented the state into competing kingdoms. Later, Mesopotamian rulers interpreted this collapse as further evidence that royal deification, even when combined with genuine piety, represented a fundamentally flawed political theology. Subsequent dynasties abandoned divine kingship entirely, with kings consistently presenting themselves as human servants of the gods rather than as divine beings themselves. Sediment cores and paleoclimatic proxies indicate that the severe drought conditions of the 4.2 kiloyear event gradually ameliorated during the 22nd century before Common Era, enabling the agricultural recovery that supported the Ur-3 Renaissance. Tree ring data from Anatolian sites show wider growth rings indicating improved precipitation beginning around 2120 before Common Era, while sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman reveal decreased Aeolian dust deposits suggesting reduced aridity across the Middle East. Archaeological surveys in previously abandoned regions show gradual reoccupation of agricultural settlements as environmental conditions improved and irrigation systems were restored. The correlation between climate recovery and political revival suggests that environmental factors played a crucial role in both the collapse and recovery of Mesopotamian civilization. Though ancient texts interpreted these environmental changes as manifestations of divine will rather than natural climatic variation, the paleoclimatic evidence for improved conditions during the 22nd century before Common Era appears consistently across multiple independent proxy records from different geographical regions. The tree ring sequences from Anatolian junipers show the transition from the extremely narrow rings characteristic of severe drought to progressively wider rings indicating improved moisture availability. The shift occurred gradually rather than abruptly, with ring widths increasing incrementally over several decades, as precipitation patterns slowly returned to levels capable of supporting agriculture. The timing of this recovery, beginning around 2120 before Common Era and continuing through the 22nd century, corresponds precisely with the archaeological evidence for agricultural revival and urban reoccupation in Mesopotamia. The sediment core data from the Gulf of Oman provides independent confirmation of climate amelioration through measurements of dust deposition rates. The cores show declining concentrations of aeolian particles in sediment layers dating to the 22nd century before Common Era, indicating reduced atmospheric dust loading as land surfaces stabilized and vegetation cover increased. The transition from peak drought conditions around 2150 before Common Era to improved conditions by 2100 before Common Era appears clearly in the sediment chemistry and particle size distributions. The rate of improvement suggests that climate recovery occurred over approximately 50 years, a timescale that matches the archaeological evidence for gradual rather than sudden revival of Mesopotamian civilization. The archaeological surveys documenting settlement reoccupation provide direct evidence of how improved climate conditions enabled agricultural revival and population recovery. Surveys in the Kaba Valley and the Jazeera region show that sites abandoned during the Akkadian collapse began receiving new occupation during the Ur-3 period, with settlement densities gradually increasing as environmental conditions improved. The pattern of reoccupation followed water availability, with sites along permanent rivers reoccupied first, followed by areas dependent on seasonal streams, and finally regions requiring intensive irrigation. The gradual expansion of settled areas tracked improvements in precipitation and water availability, demonstrating close connections between environmental conditions and settlement viability. The restoration of irrigation systems during the Ur-3 period became possible only after climate recovery provided sufficient water flow in rivers and adequate precipitation to support agriculture. Administrative tablets document systematic reconstruction of canal networks that had been abandoned during the drought, with records showing coordination between multiple communities to restore regional water management systems. The successful operation of these reconstructed irrigation networks demonstrated that environmental conditions had indeed improved sufficiently to support intensive agriculture. The agricultural productivity documented in Ur-3 administrative records approached and sometimes exceeded Akkadian period levels, confirming that climate recovery had restored the environmental foundations necessary for urban civilization. The relationship between environmental change and political transformation reveals complex interactions between natural and human factors in civilizational dynamics. The severe drought of the 4.2 kiloyear event created environmental stress that undermined Akkadian political authority, disrupted agricultural systems, and enabled invasion by peripheral populations. The climate recovery during the 22nd century created opportunities for political revival by restoring agricultural productivity. But the successful exploitation of these opportunities required effective leadership, institutional reconstruction, and social reorganization. The Ur-3 kings succeeded in rebuilding civilization not merely because climate improved, but because they implemented effective policies, invested in infrastructure reconstruction, and created administrative systems capable of managing complex economic and political challenges. The preservation of the Curse of Agade across 5 centuries demonstrates sophisticated historical consciousness among Mesopotamian scribal institutions that recognize the importance of maintaining records of past events as guides for present conduct. Temple archives at Nippur, Ur, and Babylon contained extensive collections of historical texts, royal inscriptions, and administrative documents that were carefully copied and preserved through multiple political transitions. Scribes developed cataloging systems, standardized text formats, and transmission protocols that ensured important documents would survive even when the civilizations that created them collapsed. The Sumerian king list, the Curse of Agade, and numerous other historical compositions demonstrate that Mesopotamian scholars understood history as a source of practical wisdom rather than merely a record of past events. Using historical narratives to encode political and religious lessons that would guide future generations. The temple archives that preserved Mesopotamian historical texts represented sophisticated information management systems that maintained collections numbering tens of thousands of tablets organized according to systematic principles. Archaeological excavations at Nippur uncovered archive rooms containing tablets arranged by subject matter, date, and text type, with finding aids including catalogue tablets that listed archive contents and specified storage locations for particular documents. The physical organization of archives facilitated retrieval of specific texts when needed, and enabled scribes to locate precedents, verify historical claims, and access information necessary for administrative, legal, and religious purposes. The investment in creating and maintaining these archives demonstrated institutional commitment to preserving knowledge across generations. The cataloguing systems employed by Mesopotamian archivists showed sophisticated development that anticipated modern library science principles. Catalogue tablets listed texts by their opening lines, their subject matter, and their physical characteristics including tablet size and number of columns. Cross-referencing systems connected related documents and identified different copies of the same text preserved in various locations. Quality control procedures ensured accurate copying by requiring scribes to note their names on tablets they produced, and by comparing new copies against master versions to detect and correct errors. These systematic approaches to knowledge management enabled effective preservation and transmission of information across centuries of political and social change. The standardization of text formats facilitated copying and ensured that important compositions could be recognized and transmitted accurately across different scribal schools and geographical regions. Historical texts followed established conventions for opening formulas, narrative structure, and closing statements that made them immediately identifiable to trained scribes. The use of classical Sumerian for historical and religious compositions created linguistic standardization that transcended the spoken language variations that developed over time and across regions. The development of canonical versions for important texts established authoritative standards that scribes were expected to reproduce faithfully, preventing the textual corruption that would have resulted from unconstrained variation during copying. The transmission protocols governing scribal education ensured that new generations of scribes acquired the knowledge and skills necessary to maintain archives and preserve texts accurately. Scribal training involved years of intensive study during which students memorized thousands of cuneiform signs, learned proper tablet preparation and writing techniques, and copied canonical texts under supervision of master scribes. The curriculum included historical texts, legal codes, religious literature, and scientific treatises that constituted the core knowledge every educated scribe should possess. The repetition of canonical texts through educational copying served dual purposes of training scribes and producing additional copies that could be distributed to archives throughout Mesopotamia. The practical uses of historical texts in Mesopotamian political and legal contexts motivated their careful preservation and ensured their continued relevance across changing circumstances. Royal inscriptions provided precedents for territorial claims, diplomatic relationships, and religious obligations that had implications for contemporary political decisions. Legal codes and court records established principles that guided judicial proceedings and informed legislative activities. Historical narratives about past collapses and revivals offered lessons about policies that succeeded or failed, enabling current rulers to learn from their predecessors' experiences. This utilitarian approach to history ensured that historical texts remained actively consulted rather than becoming merely antiquarian curiosities, motivating continued investment in their preservation and transmission. 20th and 21st century archaeological research has consistently validated the historical accuracy of Mesopotamian textual accounts that were once dismissed as mythological invention. The discovery of Tell Leilan's abandonment layer precisely matching the Curse of Agade's timeline, the paleoclimatic evidence confirming the 4.2 kiloyear drought event, and the material culture evidence of Gutian occupation all demonstrate that ancient scribes preserved genuine historical memories within religious and literary frameworks. This pattern of archaeological confirmation extends to numerous other Mesopotamian texts, including flood narratives, accounts of temple construction, records of military campaigns, and descriptions of diplomatic relations that have been verified through excavation, environmental analysis, and comparative textual study. The consistent validation of ancient sources suggests that modern scholars should approach Mesopotamian texts as potentially reliable historical documents rather than dismissing them as mythological fiction. The transformation in scholarly attitudes toward ancient texts represents one of the most significant developments in Near Eastern archaeology over the past century. Early scholars working in the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently approached Mesopotamian literature with skepticism born from assumptions that ancient peoples lacked historical consciousness and that religious texts necessarily represented pure mythology without historical content. The gradual accumulation of archaeological evidence that confirmed specific details in ancient accounts forced progressive revision of these dismissive attitudes, demonstrating that texts which appeared fantastic or exaggerated often preserved accurate information encoded within religious and literary frameworks that modern readers initially failed to understand properly. The Tell Leilan case exemplifies how archaeological discoveries can validate textual accounts with stunning precision. When Harvey Weiss first identified the abandonment layer at Tell Leilan in the 1980s, he recognized its potential significance for understanding the Akkadian collapse, but initially did not connect it directly to the Curse of Agade. The subsequent radiocarbon dating that placed the abandonment between 2160 and 2140 before Common Era, combined with sedimentological analysis confirming environmental causes, created exact correlation with the timeline and mechanisms described in the ancient text. The correspondence extended beyond broad outlines to include specific details about dust storms, agricultural failure, and rapid urban abandonment that the curse describes in vivid language that archaeologists initially interpreted as poetic exaggeration, but now recognize as accurate description. The paleoclimatic validation of ancient drought accounts demonstrates how scientific analysis of natural archives can confirm events that ancient texts attributed to supernatural causes. When Peter de Mennecal published his sediment core analysis in 2001, revealing the 4.2 kiloyear event's severity and precise timing, he provided objective physical evidence for the environmental catastrophe that Mesopotamian texts had described as divine punishment for Naram-Sin sacrilege. The convergence between independent scientific data and ancient textual accounts demonstrated that both preserved accurate information about the same historical events, though interpreted through different explanatory frameworks. Modern scientists attribute the drought to natural climate variability, while ancient scribes understood it as manifestation of divine will, but both correctly identified the timing, severity, and consequences of the environmental crisis. The validation of Mesopotamian flood narratives through geological and archaeological evidence provides another dramatic example of textual confirmation. The discovery of flood deposits at multiple Mesopotamian sites, dating to approximately 2900 before Common Era, confirmed that severe flooding had indeed devastated the region during the early dynastic period, as described in Sumerian texts including the Eridu Genesis and the Instructions of Shurupak. While the floods were regional rather than global, their impact on Mesopotamian civilization was catastrophic enough to generate the detailed flood narratives preserved in cuneiform literature. The archaeological confirmation of these accounts demonstrated that what had been dismissed as purely mythological flood stories actually preserved memories of genuine historical disasters. The verification of temple construction accounts through excavation has validated numerous details in royal inscriptions that describe building projects, architectural features, and construction techniques. When archaeologists excavated temples mentioned in ancient inscriptions, they consistently found that the physical remains matched textual descriptions with remarkable accuracy. Foundation deposits containing inscribed cylinders and tablets were discovered in positions described in the texts. Architectural features appeared exactly as inscribed accounts specified, and construction techniques matched those detailed in building narratives. The precision of these correspondences demonstrated that royal inscriptions preserved accurate technical information rather than serving purely propagandistic purposes. The confirmation of military campaign accounts through archaeological evidence of destruction and conquest appears repeatedly across Mesopotamian sites. Royal inscriptions describing campaigns against specific cities have been validated through discoveries of destruction levels dated to the appropriate periods, followed by occupation phases showing the cultural materials of the conquering power. The Akkadian conquest of Sumerian city-states described in Sargon's inscriptions corresponds with archaeological evidence of destruction, followed by Akkadian occupation at sites including Ur, Uruk, and Lagash. The systematic nature of these confirmations suggests that military narratives, despite their obvious propagandistic elements, preserved substantially accurate information about historical events. The implications of consistent archaeological validation extend beyond specific texts to affect fundamental approaches to ancient sources. The pattern of confirmation suggests scholars should adopt working assumptions that ancient texts potentially contain reliable historical information even when they employ religious language, mythological frameworks, or literary conventions that initially seem to indicate fictional content. This methodological shift requires careful distinction between the interpretive frameworks ancient scribes used to explain events and the factual information they preserved about those events. Modern scholars can reject ancient supernatural explanations while accepting the historical accuracy of described phenomena, recognizing that different cultures employ different explanatory models while observing and recording the same physical realities. Analysis of the Curse of Agade's literary structure reveals sophisticated compositional techniques that preserved historical information within a religious narrative framework that ensured the text's transmission and preservation. The poem's approximately 200 lines follow a carefully constructed dramatic arc that moves from Akkad's imperial glory through Naram-Sin's sacrilege to the city's utter destruction, using literary devices including foreshadowing, dramatic irony, and vivid imagery to create emotional impact that would ensure memorable transmission. The text alternates between passages describing divine actions and human consequences, establishing clear causal relationships between Naram-Sin's violation of sacred law and the catastrophic collapse that followed. This literary framework allowed the preservation of specific historical details, including names, dates, and sequences of events within a narrative structure that would be copied, memorized, and transmitted across generations as both religious instruction and historical record. The dramatic structure of the Curse of Agade employs sophisticated narrative techniques that create compelling storytelling while encoding factual information about historical events. The opening section establishes Akkad's glory through vivid descriptions of the city's wealth, power, and divine favor, creating a baseline of prosperity against which subsequent catastrophe can be measured. The middle section narrates Naram-Sin's sacrilege, and its immediate divine consequences through detailed accounts of the temple attack and Enlil's withdrawal. The final section describes the cascading disasters that destroy Akkadian civilization through systematic enumeration of agricultural, economic, social, and military collapses. This three-part structure creates rising dramatic tension that builds toward the inevitable catastrophic conclusion, engaging readers emotionally while communicating historical information. The use of foreshadowing appears throughout the text as the narrator hints at coming disaster while describing Akkad's glory, creating dramatic irony that enhances the narrative's impact. Early passages mention how Akkad's prosperity depends on divine favour, how the city's wealth derives from its religious observance, and how careful maintenance of proper relationships with the gods sustains its power. These statements establish themes that will be inverted when Naram-Sin violates sacred law, creating patterns of expectation that make the subsequent collapse feel inevitable rather than surprising. The foreshadowing serves both literary purposes by creating narrative coherence and didactic purposes by establishing clear causal connections between piety and prosperity, sacrilege and destruction. The vivid imagery employed throughout the text creates memorable descriptions that would facilitate oral transmission and ensure the narrative remained psychologically powerful across generations. The account of Naram-Sin's attack on the Akkad describes in graphic detail the physical destruction of gates, groves, and sanctuaries, creating visual images of sacrilege that would shock ancient audiences. The descriptions of agricultural collapse employ sensory language about dust storms darkening skies, withered crops in barren fields, and dying livestock that make environmental catastrophe viscerally real. The accounts of social breakdown depict abandoned villages, bandit-infested roads, and starving populations with emotional intensity that transforms abstract historical processes into human tragedies. The alternation between divine and human perspectives creates theological framework that explains historical causation while preserving factual information about events. Passages describing divine actions present the collapse as resulting from deliberate choices by Enlil and other gods, who withdraw protection, summon the Gutians, and curse Akkad to permanent destruction. Passages describing human experiences detail the practical consequences of these divine actions through accounts of crop failures, trade disruptions, military defeats, and social chaos. The juxtaposition of these perspectives allows the text to function simultaneously as religious instruction about divine power and as historical record of actual events, encoding multiple layers of meaning that serve different purposes for different audiences. The preservation of specific historical details within the literary framework demonstrates how ancient scribes maintained factual accuracy while creating compelling narratives. The text names Naram-Sin as the responsible king, identifies the Ekur at Nippur as the violated sanctuary, specifies Enlil as the offended deity, and names the Gutians as the invading people, providing verifiable historical references that anchor the narrative in actual events. The sequence of disasters follows logical progression from religious offense through environmental collapse to foreign invasion, creating causal chain that matches both ancient theological understanding and modern historical analysis. The timeline implied by the narrative structure corresponds with archaeological evidence about the rapidity of Akkadian collapse, demonstrating temporal accuracy alongside factual precision. The memorability of the text's language and structure ensured it would be transmitted accurately across generations through combination of written copying and oral recitation. The poetic structure employs parallelism, repetition, and rhythmic patterns that facilitate memorization and create aesthetically pleasing language that scribes and students would want to preserve. The emotional power of the narrative creates psychological investment that motivates transmission, as the story's dramatic impact ensures audiences remember it and want to share it with others. The didactic message about royal hubris and divine power gives the text practical utility that justifies continued copying and study, making it relevant to each new generation of rulers and scribes. The pattern of civilizational collapse following environmental crisis documented in the Akkadian case appears repeatedly across ancient civilizations, suggesting common vulnerabilities in early complex societies dependent on sophisticated irrigation agriculture. The collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt around 2150, before Common Era corresponds closely with the Akkadian collapse timeline, with Egyptian texts describing famine, social disorder, and the breakdown of central authority during the First Intermediate Period. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley shows evidence of urban abandonment and population dispersal beginning around 1900 before Common Era, possibly related to monsoon failures that disrupted agricultural systems. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 before Common Era affected civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean, with drought conditions contributing to the fall of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Mycenaean palaces, and widespread population movements. These parallel collapses suggest that ancient civilizations operating near the limits of their environmental and technological capacities were vulnerable to climate shifts that could trigger cascading failures across interconnected economic, political, and social systems. The Egyptian Old Kingdom collapse provides the closest chronological parallel to the Akkadian catastrophe, occurring within decades of the Mesopotamian crisis and showing remarkably similar patterns of environmental stress, institutional breakdown, and social chaos. Egyptian texts from the First Intermediate Period describe conditions that mirror those depicted in the Curse of Agade, including agricultural failures that left fields barren, social disorder that made travel dangerous, and governmental collapse that eliminated centralized authority. The admonitions of Ippur, an Egyptian literary text comparable to the Curse of Agade, describes how the land has been deprived of kingship, how the poor have become possessors of treasures, and how those who once wore fine linen now dress in rags, depicting social revolution that accompanied political collapse. The environmental causes of Egyptian collapse appear to have involved the same climate anomaly that devastated Mesopotamia. Nile flood records indicate dramatically reduced river levels during the late 3rd millennium before Common Era, reflecting decreased precipitation in the Ethiopian highlands that feed the Nile. The reduction in flood levels meant inadequate irrigation water for Egyptian agriculture, which depended absolutely on annual Nile inundations to deposit fertile silt and provide moisture for crops. The multi-decade duration of reduced floods created sustained agricultural crisis that undermined the economic foundations supporting pharaonic government, temple institutions, and urban populations. The parallel timing and mechanisms of Egyptian and Mesopotamian collapses suggest they resulted from the same regional climate event affecting the entire Near East. The recovery patterns in Egypt similarly parallel Mesopotamian experience, with political reunification under the Middle Kingdom, occurring approximately 2 centuries after the Old Kingdom collapse. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs, like the Ur-3 kings, demonstrated extreme piety and invested heavily in temple construction, suggesting they had internalized lessons about the importance of maintaining good relations with religious institutions. The Middle Kingdom also showed more conservative governmental structures with greater autonomy for regional authorities, indicating permanent changes in political organization resulting from collapse experiences. The Egyptian and Mesopotamian recoveries both occurred as climate conditions improved during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia before Common Era, demonstrating how environmental amelioration created opportunities for political revival. The Harappan collapse in the Indus Valley, occurring several centuries after the Akkadian crisis, shows similar patterns of urban abandonment and population dispersal that archaeological evidence links to environmental change. The sophisticated Harappan cities including Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were abandoned during the early 2nd millennium before Common Era, with populations migrating to smaller rural settlements that required less complex infrastructure and administrative coordination. Paleoclimatic evidence indicates weakening of monsoon systems that would have reduced rainfall and river flows essential for Harappan agriculture. The collapse of long-distance trade networks, the disappearance of standardized weights and measures, and the loss of urban planning all indicate civilizational simplification comparable to the post-Akkadian Gutian period. The Late Bronze Age collapse affecting civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean demonstrates how environmental stress can trigger interconnected failures across economically integrated regions. Drought conditions documented in paleoclimatic records coincided with the destruction of Hittite cities in Anatolia, the burning of Mycenaean palaces in Greece, the disruption of trade networks connecting the eastern Mediterranean, and massive population movements that ancient texts describe as invasions by sea peoples. The collapse was not caused solely by climate change, as political conflicts and military campaigns clearly played important roles, but environmental stress appears to have created vulnerabilities that military and political crises exploited, The recovery from late Bronze Age collapse required centuries and produced fundamentally different political and economic systems in the Iron Age. The common vulnerabilities these parallel collapses reveal include dependence on sophisticated agricultural systems that operated near the limits of available water resources, economic integration that created interdependencies where failure in one region could cascade to affect distant territories, and centralized administrative structures that proved brittle when faced with sustained crises exceeding their management capacities. Ancient civilizations achieved remarkable sophistication in agricultural productivity, craft production, and political organization, but these achievements rested on narrow environmental foundations that climate variability could undermine rapidly. The lack of substantial reserves or buffer capacities meant that several consecutive years of poor harvests could exhaust stored surpluses and trigger cascading failures. The Akkadian collapse offers sobering lessons for contemporary civilization as it confronts anthropogenic climate change and environmental degradation. The 4.2 kiloyear event was a relatively modest climate fluctuation compared to the scale of changes projected under current global warming scenarios, yet it was sufficient to collapse one of the ancient world's most powerful empires within a single generation. Modern industrial civilization depends on complex, interconnected systems for food production, energy supply, and economic exchange that may be even more vulnerable to climate disruption than ancient irrigation agriculture. The Akkadian experience demonstrates how environmental stress can trigger cascading failures across multiple domains, how institutional responses may prove inadequate to manage rapid change, and how the collapse of complex societies can occur with surprising speed once critical thresholds are exceeded. Understanding past civilizational collapses provides crucial insights for managing contemporary environmental challenges and building resilience into modern systems. The scale of contemporary climate change far exceeds the relatively modest 4.2 kiloyear event in both magnitude and rate of change. Current projections indicate global temperature increases of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius over the coming century, with associated changes in precipitation patterns, sea level rise, and extreme weather frequency that will affect every region of the planet. The Akkadian collapse resulted from drought that reduced agricultural productivity in one region, while contemporary climate change threatens agricultural systems globally through combinations of heat stress, water scarcity, shifting growing seasons, and increasing climate variability. The scope and speed of projected changes suggest that contemporary civilization faces environmental challenges that dwarf those that destroyed the Akkadian Empire. The vulnerability of modern agricultural systems to climate disruption may exceed that of ancient irrigation agriculture despite tremendous technological advances. Modern agriculture depends on complex supply chains for seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, and fuel that connect farms to global industrial systems. Disruptions to these supply chains through climate-related disasters, political instability, or economic crises could rapidly undermine agricultural productivity across vast regions. The specialization of modern agriculture, with particular crops concentrated in specific regions based on current climate conditions, creates vulnerabilities where climate shifts could eliminate entire production zones. The just-in-time logistics and minimal storage that characterize modern food systems mean that disruptions can create immediate shortages without the buffering capacity that traditional grain storage provided. The interconnected nature of modern economic systems creates vulnerabilities where failures in one domain can cascade rapidly to affect distant regions and different economic sectors. The global financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated how problems in one sector of one nation's economy could trigger worldwide economic disruption through interconnected banking systems and trade relationships. Climate-related disruptions to agriculture, energy production, or critical infrastructure could generate similar cascading failures through systems designed for efficiency under normal conditions, but lacking resilience when faced with sustained stress. The Akkadian experience of how trade network collapse amplified agricultural crisis provides historical precedent for understanding how interconnected systems can transform localized problems into civilization-threatening catastrophes. The institutional challenges of managing rapid environmental change may exceed governmental capacities, even in advanced industrial societies with sophisticated scientific understanding and administrative capabilities. The Akkadian administrative system, among the most advanced of its time, proved unable to manage the cascading crises triggered by sustained drought. Modern governments face challenges of coordinating responses across multiple jurisdictions, implementing policies that require short-term sacrifices for long-term benefits, and maintaining public support during extended crises. The political difficulties of climate change mitigation and adaptation suggest that even societies with full understanding of environmental threats may struggle to implement adequate responses before critical thresholds are exceeded. The speed with which complex societies can collapse once tipping points are reached represents perhaps the most disturbing lesson from the Akkadian experience. The empire transitioned from apparent stability to complete collapse within approximately one generation, demonstrating that gradual decline is not the only or even the most common pattern of civilizational failure. Modern studies of complex systems reveal that they often maintain apparent stability, while stress accumulates until sudden threshold crossings trigger rapid state changes. The possibility that contemporary civilization could experience similar rapid collapse rather than gradual decline should motivate urgent action to build resilience and reduce vulnerabilities before critical thresholds are reached. The Curse of Agade has preserved for nearly 4 millennia a fundamental message about the relationship between human power and cosmic order that resonated throughout Mesopotamian civilization and continues to offer relevant insights for understanding the limits of human dominion over nature. The text's central theme concerns the catastrophic consequences of violating sacred law through acts of hubris that disrupt the fundamental order governing human existence. Naram-Sin's self-deification and his attack on Enlil's temple represented ultimate expressions of human pride that challenged divine authority, triggering retribution that manifested as environmental, social, and political collapse. Whether interpreted as literal divine punishment or as metaphorical description of natural consequences following from violations of sustainable relationships with the environment and social institutions, the curse articulates a worldview in which human civilization exists within larger cosmic systems that impose limits on acceptable conduct. The preservation of this message through continuous textual transmission across millennia suggests Mesopotamian civilization recognized the importance of maintaining humble awareness of human limitations and respectful relationship with forces beyond human control. The theological framework of the curse presents human civilization as existing within cosmic order, maintained by divine beings who establish and enforce fundamental laws governing reality. In this worldview, human prosperity depends on maintaining proper relationships with gods who control natural forces, social harmony, and political stability. Kings who respect divine authority and observe sacred laws receive divine support that ensures agricultural productivity, military success, and social order. Kings who challenge divine authority or violate sacred laws trigger divine retribution that withdraws the supernatural support sustaining civilization, leading to environmental disasters, military defeats, and social collapse. This theological system created powerful incentives for rulers to demonstrate piety and to respect religious institutions and laws. The modern interpretation of the text can recognize its theological framework as a cultural construction, while appreciating the practical wisdom it encodes about human limitations and environmental constraints. Naram-Sin's hubris in claiming divine status and attacking religious institutions represented not violations of supernatural law, but rather political mistakes that undermined the institutional framework supporting his authority and the social cohesion necessary for effective governance. The environmental collapse that followed resulted not from divine punishment, but from climate change that Mesopotamian civilization lacked technological capacity to manage or mitigate. The text's causal framework attributes events to divine action, but the events themselves and the consequences that followed reflect real historical processes that operated according to natural rather than supernatural mechanisms. The enduring relevance of the text's message about hubris and limits transcends its specific theological framework to offer insights applicable to contemporary civilization. The modern industrial world has achieved technological capabilities that enable manipulation of natural systems on scales previously unimaginable, from redirecting rivers and reshaping landscapes to altering atmospheric composition and climate patterns. This unprecedented power has generated hubris comparable to Naram-Sin's divine pretensions, manifesting in assumptions that technology can overcome any environmental constraint and that human ingenuity can manage any problem that human activity creates. The Akkadian collapse demonstrates that such hubris, whether expressed in religious or technological terms, can lead to catastrophic consequences when human capabilities prove insufficient to manage the complex systems that sustain civilization. The text's emphasis on maintaining respectful relationships with forces beyond human control translates in modern context to recognition that human civilization exists within environmental systems that impose genuine constraints on acceptable activities. The ancient gods who punished violations of sacred law can be understood as metaphorical representations of natural limits that enforce themselves through environmental consequences when transgressed. Climate systems, ecological relationships, and biogeochemical cycles constitute the modern equivalents of divine forces that respond to human actions according to their own internal dynamics rather than adjusting to accommodate human preferences. The wisdom the curse preserves involves recognizing these limits and organizing human activities to respect rather than violate the boundaries they impose. The preservation of this message across nearly 4,000 years of continuous textual transmission demonstrates its enduring psychological and cultural resonance. Each generation of Mesopotamian scribes who copied the Curse of Agade found its message relevant to their own circumstances and important enough to preserve for future generations. The text spoke to persistent human tendencies toward hubris and to recurring needs for humility in the face of forces beyond human control. The consistency of this transmission suggests the message addresses fundamental aspects of the human condition rather than merely reflecting specific historical circumstances. Contemporary readers can recognize in the text warnings about hubris, limits, and consequences that remain relevant despite the vast differences between ancient Mesopotamian and modern industrial civilizations. The evidence examined throughout this investigation demonstrates that the Curse of Agade preserves authentic historical memory of catastrophic events that destroyed the Akkadian Empire during the late 3rd millennium before Common Era. The convergence of cuneiform textual accounts, archaeological discoveries, paleoclimatic data, and material culture analysis creates a comprehensive picture of civilizational collapse, triggered by the intersection of political hubris, environmental crisis, and institutional failure. The precision with which ancient scribes recorded these events, and the accuracy of their accounts when verified against modern scientific evidence, validates the historical reliability of Mesopotamian literary traditions and demonstrates the sophisticated historical consciousness of ancient Near Eastern civilizations. The Akkadian collapse reveals patterns that appear repeatedly across ancient civilizations facing environmental stress, suggesting common vulnerabilities in complex societies operating near the limits of their technological and environmental capacities. The rapid transformation from apparent stability to complete collapse within a single generation demonstrates that civilizational failure need not follow gradual decline, but can occur with shocking speed once critical thresholds are exceeded. The cascading nature of the collapse, where agricultural crisis triggered economic breakdown, which enabled foreign invasion, which destroyed institutional frameworks, illustrates how interconnected systems can amplify initial shocks into civilization-threatening catastrophes. The preservation of knowledge about these events through institutional mechanisms including temple archives, scribal schools, and literary traditions demonstrates how ancient civilizations maintained historical consciousness across centuries of political change and social transformation. The Mesopotamian scribal institutions that preserved the Curse of Agade for 500 years before the earliest surviving copies and then maintained it through subsequent millennia created systems for transmitting practical wisdom that transcended immediate political circumstances. This pattern of knowledge preservation through religious and educational institutions provides models for how critical information can be maintained across generations and political transitions. The lessons encoded in the Curse of Agade about the catastrophic consequences of hubris, the importance of respecting institutional limits on power, and the vulnerability of complex civilizations to environmental disruption remain profoundly relevant for contemporary global civilization. The 4.2 kiloyear event that collapsed the Akkadian Empire represents a relatively modest climate fluctuation compared to the scale of anthropogenic climate change currently underway. Yet it proved sufficient to destroy one of the ancient world's most powerful states within decades. Modern industrial civilization, with its vastly greater technological capabilities, but also its far more complex interdependencies and its operation at planetary scale, faces environmental challenges that dwarf those that destroyed ancient Mesopotamia. The Akkadian experience suggests that technological sophistication and administrative capability do not necessarily confer resilience against environmental crisis, and that institutional responses may prove inadequate when confronted with rapid change exceeding planning assumptions and management capacities. The text's enduring message about maintaining humble awareness of human limitations and respecting forces beyond human control offers wisdom that transcends its ancient theological framework to address fundamental questions about the relationship between human civilization and the natural systems within which it must operate. As contemporary society confronts climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation on scales unprecedented in human history, the curse that destroyed Akkad nearly 4,000 years ago stands as a warning about the consequences that await civilizations whose hubris leads them to transgress the boundaries that sustain their existence.